There's nothing quite like the thrill of exploring the unknown. When we think of classic horror franchises, it's hard not to instantly think of Castlevania. Inspired by the genre's most influential films, most notably the popular Hammer films, the franchise brought us some of the most cryptic moments in gaming history. Vampires were all the craze, and popular enough for Konami to base an entire series around the king of vampires himself, Dracula. My earliest memories of the series come to be through Simon's Quest. My older brother did a good deal of tape trading around its time of release, and I vividly remember him coming home with it after swapping for one of our Super Mario games. I can't remember which he traded it for, but hopefully it was Mario's Missing. Nevertheless, having an older brother has its perks, but can also be a real pain in the ass at times. If your childhood was anything like mine, then you were playing the NES when it was available to you. If that sibling had a bad day, chances were you weren't playing Nintendo in the foreseeable future. However, in time I got my hands on Simon's Quest, and the atmosphere and music alone was enough to sell me on the series. If you're familiar with my channel, you know we dive into a franchise from the very beginnings, so we'll be visiting this one soon enough. It wasn't until years later that I got around to playing Castlevania 1. I'm not quite sure why that was, but oddly enough, I wasn't drawn to the linear playstyle early on. I loved the freedom I had with Simon's Quest, and much like the Mega Man series, I started out with the later games, so naturally at a young age, I tended to just play the sequels that followed what I recently played. There were no retro game stores to familiarize one with the NES catalog. You just sort of played what was available to you or what your friend had. The NES didn't have a ton of re-releases or player's choice titles, so for me, I was lucky if I found a copy of Mega Man 1 or some of those early black box titles in the early 90s. I wouldn't get around to playing Castlevania 1 until I started high school. At this time, I took any and all opportunities to learn about game archives and preservation, and as I did, I discovered far more about the cryptic world of Castlevania. Now, for a brief moment, we need to go back to the year 1986. The increasing popularity of the Lord of Darkness sparked the interest of the higher-ups over at Konami. Lead programmer Hitachi Akamatsu began working on a new passion project. Being a massive cinema buff himself, he wanted to bring the real feel of Hollywood horror to the home console market. He approached this new hellacious platformer with what he could only describe as through a film director's eye, and would continue to build upon this vision through a unique blend of audio and visual cues that encapsulated that cinematic feel. Being familiarized with a great deal of horror tropes of old, the idea was to create that unique feel of venturing throughout a classic horror flick, and players would do just that as the team's vision came to life, debuting on Nintendo's all-new Famicom Disk System. Inspired by Raiders of the Lost Ark, our new protagonist was molded through the eyes of Indy himself. Wielding the infamous vampire killer, Simon Belmont sets out on a quest to banish the many creatures of the night, equipped with an assortment of finely tuned sub-weapons to repel this new emerging evil. The original soundtrack would be composed by newcomers to Konami, Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima. This would be the duo's first big breakout roles as fresh new composers. There was no sort of collaborative effort between the two, but more so an individual list of contributions, with Terashima credited for composing the now iconic vampire killer, and Yamashita responsible for writing many of the later stage themes, along with my personal favorite, Wicked Child. There's no denying the legacy these two women left on the franchise today, as Vampire Killer alone is one of the most iconic Vania themes of all time, and it's hard to not hum the tune when witnessing that opening cutscene. As the stage was set, a hero would be born, and fans stateside will become familiarized with the new Simon Belmont through his adventures on the NES. Now, the Castlevania series timeline can get a bit messy, nothing to the degree of the Zelda or Sonic series per se. Konami would straight up retcon certain games over the years to have a more coherent storyline throughout. So to really just do this the right way, I'm just going to focus on the now and branch out from there. To put things into perspective, our story opens in the year 1691, putting us exactly a century after the events of Belmont's Revenge, which would end off with Christopher Belmont vanquishing the Lord of Darkness himself while wielding the holy whip we know as the Vampire Killer. Transylvania would now be blessed with peace and prosperity for another century. However, like clockwork, the hearts of men slowly turn cold, allowing Dracula to regain power. Word quickly spreads as his loyal followers grow in numbers, as it now appears inevitable that rebirth would soon follow, by ritual occurring every 100 years. Deep inside the ruins of an old monastery, a black mass would be conducted as a sacrifice is made in efforts to revive the Prince of Darkness. Just then, a storm begins to brew in the far-off distance as storm clouds begin encapsulating the town, striking the monastery in moments that pass, resurrecting Count Dracula once more. Simon Belmont, descendant of Christopher Belmont, which is technically his great-grandson, if I'm not mistaken, gets word of Dracula's revival. His discoveries reveal that the Lord of Darkness only grows in power through each new resurrection, and has now resurfaced in Transylvania along with his legion of loyal followers. Simon, the lone descendant of the Belmont clan and current wielder of the Vampire Killer, is prophesied with restoring peace and stability back to the lands, sealing away Dracula Dracula once more. Castlevania is known for its unforgiving action platforming roots that teaches you through a great deal of trial and error. It's sort of this sweet blend of arcade score-based action mixed with adventure elements that reward you through a point system for killing enemies and clearing the many stages ahead. The amount of points gained is dependent on how quickly you can finish that specific stage, rewarding you through bonuses that rack up additional lives. The classic series of releases along the NES are among some of the most challenging the franchise has to offer. This in large part is due to the many awkwardly placed pits and traps that will send you to an early demise. Pair that with a difficulty curve that increases enemy stats, dealing you substantially more damage the deeper you travel the castle keep. You'll be starved for a relief, whipping walls to find power-ups to increase your sub-weapon count, and search out those delicious mystery meats that are hidden about those dirty-ass walls only a true warrior has the stomach for. Everything factors into that infamous phrase, NES hard, we have come to respect, but nothing compares to the heartbreak you will endure from this game's knockback. Simon must be suffering from some real internal nerve damage as he reflexes at the mere sight of a ghostly figure. This single-handedly is the most crippling aspect of the series and is what caps off the formula for that Castlevania challenge. This is what separates the men from boys and what needs to be overcome in order to be an absolute legend. As your muscle memory kicks in, you quickly hone in with pinpoint accuracy, executing each attack in style. The series' early roots feels inspired by those early single-screen arcade games, as the challenge comes through your score and progression, based around your performance and how you navigate each stage block. The stage blocks represent the many areas of Dracula's castle that are beautifully constructed with a specific theme attached to them, inspired by much of the literature and lore that is wrapped up in the franchise. Simon's primary weapon comes through his trusty vampire killer, which can ultimately be upgraded to increase its overall length and strength, dealing far greater damage to the ghostly residents residing within the castle walls. Simon also utilizes his arsenal of sub-weapons scattered throughout his journey. These can be acquired by whipping candles or defeating Drax's minions. Each sub-weapon requires a specific amount of hearts, like ammunition for firing. Simon can acquire flasks of holy water to heave towards enemies that, if targeted just right, can do substantial damage over multiple successions. It's also pretty sweet just watching the many night creatures go up in flames at the slightest touch. There's the dagger that delivers a straight shot to the heart of the many beasts roaming on sight. The axe is an excellent anti-air weapon that quickly brings down the more challenging winged beasts and floating heads hovering the hallways. It's also an excellent weapon to equip to reach the many out-of-range enemies lurking atop the higher platforms. The cross is Simon's trusty weapon of choice, thrown about, stretching the span of the screen only to return in tactile fashion. The stopwatch is another sweet addition that freezes your enemy's movement momentarily, allowing you to deal some much-needed damage with ease. Keep in mind you can discover the double and triple shots, which are absolute game changers the further you journey ahead. These allow you to fire your sub-weapons 2 to 3 times in succession depending on the corresponding number shown. These will be integral for you to do some additional damage to late game bosses that will need to be taken out as quickly as possible before further damage is endured as fights wage on. Each stage throughout the Castlevania experience captures a narrative foretold. From the iconic opener, you know you're in for something special. Simon marching his way through the castle courtyard and barreling his way through the front doors of Drax's estate always gets you pumped up. The entryway itself is the perfect introductory segue, getting you accustomed to the in-game physics while striking down ghoulish figures, keeping a close eye out for leopards that prey atop the winding stairways. Wielding the vampire killer, you never miss a beat as it slowly becomes second nature to routinely whip candles, racking up your inventory. The basement is flooded at high tide, with sea creatures aplenty rising up sporadically to test your reflexes. The first time I laid eyes on the giant phantom bat, 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind, quickly equipping the axe and hacking away for a speedy victory. Holy hell, now this is something I could get behind. The tower feels like your first true test, scaling the red brick stone stairwell of the castle keep, discovering hidden treasures while treading ever so lightly across some wicked stretches. Reaching the chapel, you face off with Medusa herself, whom surprisingly can be approached a variety of ways. I never had too much difficulty finding a simple strategy for her. The game gives you the tools early on to best her in battle. The castle courtyard is where all the Nightmare's festivities occur, a boneyard full of snipers at every turn. If it's not the skeletal infantry spread out accordingly, it's the ravens that pick you off when attempting to cross the castle bridge. Here your fight or flight kicks in, homing in on oncoming projectiles while clapping back with a 1-2 combination of your whip and cross. This is why the double and triple shot becomes so integral for a solid run, especially when you reach the end of the bridge and encounter a pair of mummified twinsies blocking your path. You can really get things rolling early with an overwhelming barrage of attacks that will leave these big bads lying in a pile of wraps. The catacombs is by far the trickiest stage of the game, game. Take everything you learned thus far and ramp the difficulty up tenfold. Each step must be taken with utmost caution, planning out your trajectory as you jump across the varying moving platforms, praying you don't misstep. It's easy to lose momentum here, and many enemies are awkwardly placed to throw you off your game. You need to stack hearts going into the final stretch. The hardest part about the fight with old Frankie is his buddy Igor that roams the room, keeping you distracted the entirety of the fight. The key is to put Franklin down quickly, before Shoulder Guy starts acting a fool on sight. By stage 5, you feel battle tested, and you will earn your stripes after this gauntlet. A dungeon full of Drax troops that will test your platforming knowledge. In a sense, you need to do a near perfect run if you want to be able to hold your own against Death himself, whom waits ahead. The hallway before this duel is legendary, keeping a steady rhythm as you pivot past Medusa heads, maintaining your composure while hacking away at Axe Knights ahead, pushing them back with every blow. Death himself is the real endgame boss for me personally. This fight requires precision, navigating about a brutal assault from his scythe. This is where your actions prior will dictate the outcome of this fight. Acquiring the double or triple shot early on and scooping up the cross is key to victory, and yes, I know you can spam the guy with holy water, but this isn't a guided run from the Nintendo hotline. The clock tower is your final test. The Prince of Darkness waits ahead. It's a pretty short stage collectively, full of iconic imagery and stage hazards that capture the final hour. Hunchbacks are dropped below into the internal framework of the tower, making your path a hell to journey. The stage visually is stunning, witnessing the castle's gear system on full display, powering Drax's infernal machine he calls home. As you make your way to the final act, you gaze upon an iconic scene that portrays the moment perfectly, solidified today as one of the most iconic moments in gaming history. Marching your way into Dracula's keep, the King of Vampires quickly emerges before you, raising his cloak for a scourge of flames projected towards our hero. Patience is key, anticipating his movements, clearing his projectiles, and whipping away until you take his head clean off. Seriously, this moment breaks me every time. I can't help but start rolling. Dude's head literally gets punted at field goal range. Just as you think you put the count down, he reveals his true form. There's some good strats out there for this fight, but growing up, I learned the hard way, taking my L's and going at this beast with what you know. Holy water to stun him just long enough to land some clean shots to the head. As Simon puts the final dagger through the heart of the beast, he seals the Prince of Darkness away once more, solidifying a good future for the lands of Transylvania. However, ridding the world of evil comes with a price, as our hero suffers a fatal blow at the hands of Dracula, a curse now inflicted upon the prideful Belmont that may only be lifted through the trials ahead. Sorry for leaving you guys on a cliffhanger here. Oh, and by the way, if your bloodthirst hasn't been quenched from your initial playthrough, you return to the first stage after the credits roll, retaining your upgrades and points accumulated for a second quest, or what the pros call a second loop, ramping up the frights that much more. The original Castlevania in large part still holds up today. As I mentioned, I didn't start off with this one. I wouldn't have that opportunity until many years later, and I'm thankful I got to. Castlevania has that sweet blend of momentum-based tactile progression that requires a great deal of strategy to approach the road ahead, yet as the years go on, I only grow a stronger appreciation for it. For a game released as early as '86, it's a tremendous accomplishment, a time where the gaming industry was slowly discovering its identity along with the genre collectively. There's something special about the challenge presented here that can be painstakingly frustrating in delivery, yet in return gives you this great sense of reward, conditioning you to be the very best version of yourself. The challenges that rise can be approached through a variety of upgrades and unique sub-weapons that complement your specific playstyle. There's many ways to enjoy the classic Castlevania series today. The Anniversary Collection is a great way to start off, granting you access to each title's Japanese counterpart, along with a great deal of bonus content to get you cultured to the long-running franchise. There's also save states and rewind features that allow you to leave off where you last bit the dust. In the busy world we live in today, many of us may not have the time to allocate to mastering the ins and outs of a traditional Castlevania experience, and that's okay too. I for one have grown to appreciate these new features, and it's great for those who want to just enjoy a game in its entirety by witnessing the full story. For many of us growing up, our eyes never gazed upon many of those classic NES end screens. For those that want that true NES challenge, I would never tell you to shy away from doing so without saves. I will always encourage you to bust out that original cartridge and experience it firsthand on your NES. There is nothing quite like it. The original Castlevania formula is second to none, and as you witness Dracula's castle crumble after giving your blood, sweat, and tears, this aura surrounds you with that of a true legendary Belmont, the House of Belmont for that matter. With that said, Simon's fate now rests in the hands of you, the player. When we return, we will look at one of the most misunderstood installments in the franchise to date as we embark on our storied sequel, Simon's Quest. Thanks for joining me.